Welcome to day 2, strategy 2, in 5 strategies for getting the most from yourself. In day 1, we looked at the strategy, do what you want, not what you should. And we looked at the language we use around tasks, so that when we feel that something is really important to do, we tend to apply words like I should, must, or I've got to, in the hope that this will make it more likely that we'll actually do it. But the reality is that this often makes it harder and more daunting to do the task. This strategy is a great quick fix by changing our language around the task to change our perspective on it, and therefore making it more likely that we'll do the task and stopping us trying to shame ourselves into doing it. But recognizing when we use these words can also be a good indicator for us that maybe something else is going on. Why is it that we feel that we have to use these words to get us to do these things? Sometimes we use the words around stuff we don't want to do because it's just boring or unpleasant. My experience that it's often around stuff about which we feel vulnerable. The reason we're having difficulty doing these things is that consciously or subconsciously, they're bringing out or accessing a vulnerability in us. So as people who put ourselves in the public eye, what makes us feel vulnerable? Well, when we put ourselves out there, we're laying ourselves open to being judged, and we're inviting judgment. We regularly put ourselves in front of an audience, knowing that they're going to make an assessment of our performance. But more than this, so often we can see that assessment not to be of just what we do, but also of who we are, and that can make us feel really vulnerable. So what's the difference between being judged for what you do versus being judged for who you are? To look at this, I'm going to look at Brené Brown's definition of shame and guilt. Brené Brown says that guilt is the emotion around I did something bad. Shame is about I am bad. Shame is correlated with depression, addiction, and suicide, whereas guilt, on the other hand, is inversely correlated with those things. When we think about judgment, what makes us feel vulnerable is the fear of making a fool of ourselves, the fear of shame. So what do we tend to do to protect ourselves against this shame? We put on armour. Commonly, this armour can be perfectionism. We won't risk feeling shame if it's perfect. So our aim is perfection. If we don't do it yet, we don't risk shame either. And perfectionism can lead to procrastination, because if we have this feeling it's not perfect and it needs to be perfect, then we can justifiably put it off. And then, of course, there's complete avoidance. If we don't do it at all, we run absolutely no risk of the shame whatsoever. So when we start to use these forms of armour, perfectionism, procrastination, and avoidance, this is when you see these words should, must, ought, and got to cropping up. Because we're putting off or avoiding these things, we try and strong arm ourselves into doing the task at hand. So the irony is, in order to avoid shame, we're using words that actually induce shame and encourage us to feel bad about ourselves if we don't do what we should. So when do we feel these vulnerabilities? If we look at the tasks or thoughts we tend to apply smog words to around public performance, chances are it will obviously be around the performance itself. I should set up that meeting because, let's face it, I've been avoiding or putting off doing it. I must submit that application. I ought to arrange a recital. Very often, it's around the preparation that goes into the performance. I must prep that case. I should put together my business plan. I ought to practice that piece. It can also be in the aftermath, where the should-haves and ought-to-haves come in. Not only dealing with your own opinion of what happened, but often the layers of other people's opinion of what you did, and even what people might be thinking you think of your own performance. Do they think I didn't notice that mistake? I should have done this better. I should have done that. Do they realize I know I should have done this? So my second strategy is to acknowledge your vulnerabilities. Why is this? Well, sometimes the vulnerability we seek to hide or run away from is not as big or scary as we seem to think. And when we acknowledge what we're actually worried about, it's easier for us to see that. Often, when we do this, when we acknowledge what we truly feel vulnerable about, it shrinks or changes or disappears. As Brené Brown would say, fear, like shame, grows in darkness and secrecy. When it is talked about, it is always smaller than when it is avoided. Once you've acknowledged your fear or vulnerability, you can assess the logic of your response and remind yourself of your true goal, the thing you really want. This way, strategy one is more likely to work, and you're more likely to get these things done. So, strategy two, acknowledge your vulnerabilities. I'm Hattie Volker, qualified life coach accredited with the International Coaching Federation. If you'd like to make sure that you get all 5 of my strategies, then click the button that will appear at the end of the video. And if you'd like to find out more about how life coaching could transform your life, then visit my website at findyourtruevoice.co.uk.